everything that lives is designed to end. We are perpetually trapped in a never-ending spiral of life and death. Is this a curse? Or some kind of punishment? I often think about the God who blessed us with this cryptic puzzle, and wonder if we'll ever have the chance to kill him.
That quote wasn't from a movie, but actually a video game, Nier Automata. I wrote many years ago for the Gnostic Journal an article on Gnostic themes in video games, and should loop back one day in a show or post. But yes, video games with their false realities, levels of archonic bosses, and speculation on what it means to be human is a great vehicle for Gnostic philosophy. And sticking it to the man if you can go all the way. The man being Jehovah himself and his cosmic central scrutinizer. For you Zappa fans.
I am the architect. I created the Matrix. I've been waiting for you.
Killing God, you might say? Well, it was Elie Wiesel who said, "The real joy of God is to be defeated by man." In the dice game of Shiva, as Richard Smoley wrote, the supreme being must lose so that consciousness can expand in both him and humanity.
God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the silicon revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrot. Nipples for men.
Furthermore, in a more Gnostic tone, I like what listener Vanessa wrote in our Facebook group, The Inner Sanctum of Gnosis. She said, God does not play dice with the universe. He plays poker, and we are falling for his bluff. And as my friend Jim responded, what an ace-hole. Ah yes, heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. Especially when you come to play dice with Shiva at Aeon by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week I, your host, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in. Always broadcast through the God above God dat can.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
Welcome so much on this early September, the year of our Demiurge 2017. With or without earth, wind, and fire. You're going to discover new heroic dimensions of yourself you never thought you had. Finally unleash your indwelling Orpheus and dancing Inanna to create so much wonder. You're going to finally write your own gospel and live your own myth, like the ancient Gnostics were wont to do. All of this couldn't come at a better time in these tenuous times full of bigotry, mediocrity, and confusion. The Gnostic solution that I just spoke about is more important than ever. In the end and in relation, I agree with AA that the solution to the political, social world you see outside is a spiritual one, and nothing else. You could also say the solution is an artistic one, a magical one, because that's when we access our inner Prometheus and steal fire from the gods and their catamites in the establishment. That's when we shift the narrative to one that works for us and helps the least of our brothers.
They need some kind of hero.
Then be a hero.
Oh, no. You don't understand. I'm not even supposed to be here.
That's right. You came a long way to find something that isn't out here. Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
Our astral guest will certainly teach us that, and it's a long overdue interview. He'll also be discussing the state of modern magic and conspiracy theories, all with his keen mind and what I feel is a kind heart full of gnosis and imagination. That is Michael Hughes, author of the Blackwater Lights trilogy.
I think he's right. There's something about this that's so black. It's like, how much more black could this be? And the answer is none.
Michael speaks on Forteana, the paranormal, psychedelia, pop culture, and other topics. And he teaches regular workshops on magic and the tarot. Michael was also the mind behind the Bind Trump spell that caught the world by storm. And he'll also share that experience, as well as the perils and opportunities of being a horror writer these days when all the horror seems to be right outside our doors and behind our screens. For more information on Michael, please visit, you got it, michaelmhughes.com.
Klaatu, Veranda. Okay then. That's it.
Members will get the second part of Michael's fantastic interview, and much appreciation to you lords of deconstruction and spiritual entrepreneurs who support on a weekly basis. Help keep this red pill cafeteria open. AM by Gnostic Radio is 100% supported by the audience, and I can't do it without you. I've been putting out more podcasts, articles, and even videos than ever. And things are growing, and more servants of Saklas are being liberated. And what a community we're building, a fortress of solitude and plentitude in these dark times of chaos and mass idiocracy. Of so many reality tunnels of confirmation bias. And a mass campaigning of divide and conquer by the powers and principalities. Like Philip K. Dick wrote, the basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use them.
This is a marketing holocaust. 24 hours a day. For the rest of our lives, the powers that be are hard at work, dumbing us to death.
Add to words today's algorithms and social media censorship to that manipulation. We're all falling for God's bluffing during poker when he just wants to lose.
I am the supreme being. I'm not entirely dim.
And again, we're owning our own narrative here, putting all of our cards on the table, building vast futures of light. The sets of society have fragmented us too much, chopping us like Osiris into 14 pieces. And now it's time for individuation, peace, friendship.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share, undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Instead of trying to kill or defeat God, maybe we should first kill the Buddha on the road. Kill our heroes, as AWOL Nation sang. Kill those false realities, which are basically everything that is outside right now, in some way or another. Kill your false self and find out who you really are, what you were meant to be, which is something great. Something that reaches to the stars and beyond.
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
As Jesus says in the Muslim work, Revival of the Religious Sciences, recorded by Al-Ghazali, the world is a bridge. Pass over it. Do not linger on it. Store up for yourself something which the fire will not devour. The apostles asked, "What is that?" Jesus answered, "Mercy." Led us to the remarkable interview with Michael Hughes. so much gnosis, and so much magic.
You know the dangers.
I do.
This is a serious undertaking. It's not fucking astral projection or runes. This is real stuff we're playing with. Real angels, real demons.
I know this.
You read cunts on the internet saying it's just mental states, that you're guardian angels, your higher self. Psychobabble bollocks. So you'll go for days without sleep, fasting, back-breaking rites, ritual sex. You'll be at the very edge. You ready for all that, darling?
I am. I've read up on the Kabbalah.
You don't think this is a tree of Sephiroth, because it's not? You've been looking shit up on the internet. Root, this is Gnosticism.
I was told it was based on the Kabbalah.
It's there as grammar, a structure. The Kabbalah is an exploration of God. We're doing something much darker.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Michael M. Hughes to discuss his Blackwater Lights trilogy and other sundries. How are you doing this evening, Michael?
I'm doing great. It's really a pleasure to be on your show. When I first started listening to podcasts, yours was one of the first I listened to, so it's really great to be here.
Wow, well, at least we know part of the story, how you damned your soul. You listen to this show. But, yeah, it's long overdue having you on, but better late than never. So good deal. Thanks for being here. Well, why don't we get to beyond having the fortune or misfortune of listening to Aeon Byte. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, Michael, and how you hitchhike into esoteric and artistic circles. How did you become a heretic?
I think I was born a heretic. Ever since I was a kid, I was into strange stuff. It was the 70s, so that explains a lot of it. My whole aesthetic was really informed by really the supernatural 70s, everything from Kolchak the Night Stalker to In Search Of, and Ouija boards and UFOs and things like that. I think I inherited a good bit of it from my father, who he was an interesting guy. He used to read books about ghosts and UFOs, Frank Edwards books, all the mass market paperbacks on those subjects, and he'd leave them lying around. So I would, of course, pick them up and just inhale those books. I was always in the monster movies and anything supernatural, anything weird, anything esoteric. It was just I felt like that's who I was. Apart from picking this stuff up from my dad, I had a lot of kind of weird experiences as a kid, including lights in my room, which I've never quite been able to figure out. I had bouts of sort of sleep paralysis, but also waking paralysis, where I would be in the hallway near my bedroom, and I would see light in my bedroom, and I remember sort of just collapsing and going unconscious for a while. Even though my parents were a few feet away, they never seemed to be alarmed by this stuff. So even once I woke up at the bottom of the stairs in my house, and if you remember what it's like being a kid and finding yourself in a dark, horrifying place, the spookiest place that you can imagine in your entire house, that really shook me up. I always felt like my life was really wrapped up in strangeness and the supernatural. I used to like hanging out at a little a graveyard near my house. It was from the 19th century, and I'd heard that the bodies were moved, but I always found it was kind of creepy anyway. And I was a strange kid, and that has never changed.
And what would you say are some of your main literary and occult influences, or perhaps they're both?
Yeah, I think it is a bit of both. I always loved horror, and I was lucky to grow up in the era before, young adult fiction was really a thing. So if I wanted to read imaginative stories, I read things like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Bram Stoker. So I read all the classics. So I feel like was very much lucky to read that stuff. Where the macabre and the horror genre really sort of originated, and that was also while reading the fictional stuff, I was always reading everything I could about witchcraft and occultism and spiritism and anything I could find in the library that had anything to do with the supernatural, with the esoteric. I remember reading a book by Hans Holzer, a book about witchcraft that he wrote with Sybil Leek, the famous medium and witch, and that blew my mind. That had a little bit of a satanic invocation in the book, and I remember being terrified as I was reading these words aloud, thinking I might be damning my soul, because I was a good Catholic boy at the time too. And I also have to say that anyone who gets into ritual or magic, things like that, having a background as a Catholic is a really good place to start, because even as a kid, I was just impressed by the rituals of the church and the pomp and the incense and the candles and the music and that sort of thing. Even though fairly early in life I started to doubt that I would be Catholic for very long. I sort of rebelled rather early before I was confirmed, and basically told the priest I was getting confirmed just to please my parents, and he said, "Oh, okay, whatever, it's your soul." So, as far as being attracted to magic and ritual, it was that was also something I felt very early in my life. And then, I got a little bit older, and when horror really exploded in the 80s, I was in my early teens, and I just glommed on to Stephen King. And I still love King. I think he could use an editor sometimes, or maybe a group of editors to pare down his voluminous prose. But he was a major influence. He took, I think I read Night Shift, which is his collection of short stories, and then I read Salem's Lot. And Salem's Lot blew me away, and it really changed my perspective on horror. And it showed me that horror didn't have to be the creaky old Victorian house or the moors or the haunted castle sort of thing, but that horror, even tropes like vampires, could be updated and transplanted into the suburbs, into a small town. And that was a revelation. I think that's one thing King really did. And then, of course, the horror genre just exploded. The mass market paperback market. I read everything I could get my hands on in that genre. And through it all, I still have always been fascinated by Forteana, UFOs, cryptids, particularly UFOs. And I was fortunate enough to have a sighting of my own when I was in my 20s that really drove my interest pretty hard, to the point where I was probably a bit obsessive for a number of years about the UFO phenomenon.
Where was this, Michael? Was this around the Baltimore area?
This was actually in Ocean City, Maryland. So it was on the coast, and it's kind of a long story. I've told it on a couple other podcasts, but in a nutshell, the the day of the sighting, I woke up that morning. I'd been having dreams about UFOs, which is not that unusual, but because I was into the subject, but I never actually had dreams about UFOs before. And in the dream, there was a panel discussion, and the panelists were sort of like a Jacques Vallée type guy, and he was arguing sort of the Vallée approach to UFOs. And then, there was the Stan Freeman type guy, and he was a nuts and boltser. And then there was a David Icke person, and he was arguing that UFOs are that aliens are actually reptilians and they're eating our children, things like this. And I woke up and thought, that's weird, so I wrote it down. And later that night, I went out to the beach with my girlfriend, and as we walked along the beach, I saw what looked like a face in the sand, like a head, but it had been obscured by like a tire track that rolled across it. And that made me flash back to a couple weekends before, where I was also at the beach, but it was a different part of the beach. And some friends and I had been making little sand sculptures, and I made the face of an alien with his arm and his hand like he was waving hello. One friend did it, made an elephant, another made a smiley face or something like that. But at that moment, when I saw this face, I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting synchronicity. So I looked up at the sky, and my girlfriend at the time was down by the water, a little farther away from me, a beautiful, clear night. And I looked up at the sky, and I said mentally, and about 90% jokingly, I just said to the sky, I said, okay, if you're out there, now is the perfect time to show yourselves. And, so I walked down with my girlfriend, and a few minutes later, she was pointing at the sky going, what are they? And when I looked up, she had seen two orange lights, and they were kind of bobbing next to each other. But when I looked at where her finger was pointing, they started shooting across the sky. And at one point, they came together and flew as one thing for a little while. And again, they were like orange blobs, sort of oval shaped, maybe the size of like larger than a grain of rice, but really bright in the sky. And after they flew as one, they broke off again. And they were doing these really crazy sort of acrobatics that looked impossible. And then they shot off across the sky. And for me, I'd been aware of all sorts of ideas about UFOs at that point. I think I was 24 years old. I'd read a lot of stuff, including Whitley Strieber's Communion. The fact that, either that was an incredible coincidence that I asked to see them and then they appeared. But the dream, that morning, the face, the synchronicity of seeing the face after I'd carved a face of an alien the week before, it really drove home to me that there's something deeper to this stuff, and it's tied to consciousness. That it's not just the little guys in spaceships, and that I've never been able to think of the phenomenon in that nuts and bolts sort of way since that happened. And my first novel, Blackwater Lights, was sort of a way for me to play with that idea that maybe these lights that we see in the sky, maybe they're not spaceships at all. Maybe there's something different. Maybe they're tied to our consciousness, and things like that. It's not an original idea by any means, but when you have an experience like that, there's no going back to the little guys in their crafts flying around anymore.
Oh, agreed. Your experience parallels my experience, which I've spoken about in other podcasts. I won't do it here, but I completely understand where you're coming from and how this journey begins. So why don't we get to Blackwater Lights? Tell the audience a little bit about the plot of the book.
Yeah, well, it starts pretty simply as a guy named Ray Simon, who's a school teacher in Baltimore. And he gets a call from his friend Kevin. Kevin lives in West Virginia. And as Kevin and Ray grew up together, they haven't seen each other in a while. But when they were kids, they went to a summer camp in West Virginia. And both of them have been concerned about what might have happened at that camp. They both have very scant, vague memories and just sort of little bits of images that they remember, and they've asked their parents about it, and they've never been able to get to the bottom of what happened at this camp. But they're both haunted by a feeling that something really bad happened. And the images that they remember are things like doctors, machinery, being very frightened, being taken out into the woods at night. But again, it's almost as if these memories are just, hidden somehow. So Ray gets a call from his friend Kevin in West Virginia, and it's a late night call, so he's a little alarmed when he gets it. And Kevin says, "Hey, I know what happened. It happened here, and I know what happened. I figured it out." And Ray says, "Well, what happened?" And Kevin says cryptically, "Sorry, I can't tell you over the phone. You're just going to have to come here." And Ray says, "Well, look, I've got school is ending. I've got to, take care of administrative stuff." And Kevin says, "You have to. This is it. This is, we've been wondering about this for years. We've been having nightmares about it. We talk about it, but I actually know what happened. You have to come out here." So that's sort of the hook that pulls him into the story. And he goes to this little town of Blackwater in West Virginia, and he pulls up to Kevin's place, and Kevin's gone. Kevin left him a note and says, "Hey, I had to run off to Seattle. Sorry, my server farm is burning up. You just hang for a while, and I'll be in touch." And that's where the story starts going. So you've got the classic, a person goes to a town. A person goes somewhere, and then it's an unknown place, and weird stuff starts happening. The first real mystery is that Ray sees, like what I saw, he sees two orange lights in the sky doing crazy things that conventional aircraft do not do. And as they fly over him, they sort of pause, and he feels like they're observing him, and then they disappear. And that's how it begins.
Yes, and I should tell the audience, like we spoke before, I really enjoyed it. I am at the epilogue today, right before our interview, and I don't want to use the cliches that I was told not to use in creative writing. Don't say it flows well and all that, but the pacing is very good, and I was gripped by the story. And I guess that's a question I have for you. You just mentioned about Stephen King and too much detail, and many authors do that, from George R. Martin to J.R. Tolkien. Your book seems it just goes with the flow. How do you know, as a writer, how much detail to use in the scenery and describing characters? It seems to me you're more of a minimalist. You're just going to let the reader make up their mind what things look like.
Yeah, I'm kind of the school of using fewer words, really, than being real loquacious. I think it was Elmore Leonard who came up with the rule that you leave out the parts that readers find boring. So I try to keep my prose really tight and clean. I edit like a fiend to really try to trim away the extraneous stuff and just let the story proceed. And that's I can't help it. That's just the way I write. To some people it might be too lean, it might be sparse, but it's the way my writing comes out, and it's the only way it actually works for me.
Well, it worked for me. And is Blackwater a real town?
No, Blackwater's kind of I went to college in a town called Elkins, West Virginia, and there's a town near there called Blackwater Falls. So Blackwater itself is kind of an amalgamation of a couple different small towns that I know in that area. And the book references real places, and I like I like writing fiction. I think, especially weird fiction or dark fiction that has elements of horror, fantasy, sci-fi, things like that. I always find it's more if there's a little bit of verisimilitude, if there's real stuff in it. So it's there are mentions of real towns and things like that, but also some of the elements of conspiracy and history and things like that are referenced in the book are taken from reality. And I love the idea that maybe a reader is reading my book and comes across something like MK Ultra and then looks it up and finds out there really is something called MK Ultra. So I like to sprinkle real stuff into the fiction. I think that makes it a more interesting story, blurring the lines of the boundaries between real stuff and fiction is disorienting. And I think that's a great that if you can do that to a reader, if you can make them feel sort of like, well, how much of this is true? I think that's a really great thing to do when you're working in dark fiction.
Definitely keeps you on your toes. I mean, again, you would say this is, or as I like to say, all fiction is autobiographical, and sometimes it's prophetic. Do you see yourself in Ray? I don't think you're really Kevin, who's sort of the porn king, ruler of this great porn site.
Yeah, it is autobiographical, but it's not. It's always hard. I think we put a lot of ourselves into various characters and things. I like Ray. I think he's he's an interesting character, but I don't see him as really as really me so much as himself. And I think you've written fiction too, so the characters just kind of come to life and start doing their own things, and that's when they're real. They feel when they start doing things that you don't expect them to, or do something odd, then it really feels like that they've developed some kind of agency.
Yes, and I've always liked the saying. I forgot who said it. Who said it? Might have been Vonnegut. I'm not sure. But he said, never love your characters more than God does. In other words, sometimes you have to kill some off. Sometimes you have to sometimes they have to do really stupid, bad things, or just don't love them too much. It makes them more real. Right.
It's a very Gnostic sort of attitude, of course.
Yeah. You don't want to, especially when you bring in the demiurge. And, and I also like, when I was reading it, it starts out pretty tame. For a while I was like, man, this Michael, he's just going to stay with PG-13. But the gore factor really got crazy towards the end, especially as you're bringing more conspiracy theories and so forth. And I thought that was interesting too, because we're talking Stephen King, who sometimes likes to start with just real gore at the beginning and then lay off the pedal. Is that something you intentionally do, sort of build it up into an R-rated machine, which was, some scenes were just very disturbing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to vary the intensity, especially when you're writing horror or dark thriller type fiction, because and I've always been a fan. Again, my aesthetic goes back to the 70s and things like Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, Tom Tryon's The Other, things like that, which nowadays they call it quiet horror, which is a term I sort of don't like, because I think even quiet horror has really loud moments, and so for me, I like to think of this trilogy in particular as sort of an exploration of mystery and different facets of a larger mystery. And I think the only way you can do that well is to pull your reader along and just release bit by bit, a little trickle here, a trickle there. And so the reader feels like they're putting together the larger picture with the protagonist. And then, of course, you hit them with, I'm certainly not afraid to shock. What does bother me is people who say, "Oh, I don't read horror. I can't handle blood and guts and things like that." Well, that's only one aspect of horror. Horror isn't defined by slasher movies or Saw or this body porn type gruesomeness. Horror does usually involve some of that, but I'm not a fan of just throwing gore at people just to shock them. I think it has to be integral to the story. So I hope that the when the gruesome things happen here, and they are gruesome because gruesome things happen in reality, and I hope it's not seen as gratuitous. I think if you're going to write something that is viscerally horrifying, visceral in the literal sense of the word, it has to feel like it's part of the story. It can't just be thrown at someone to gross them out.
And I'm sure you feel the same way about the dreaded sex scene. That's one thing. Of course, like any writer, I have challenges because too much, too little. Do I want to turn them on? Do I want to make sure that the characters are bonding and I express this? But in your book, the sex scenes, I think, were perfect. Not too much. I got what was going on, and sometimes there was romance, and sometimes it was just wicked, wicked stuff, black magic.
Yeah, those are the two poles of human existence, really. Sex and death, and that's why I think horror is such a great thing to work with. But yes, I believe that it's so easy to write an awful sex scene, and the best sort of sexual stuff in books, I think, is when it just hints. It pulls you into it, and then it lets you go figure out the rest of it, instead of these really mechanical descriptions of what's going on.
He was throbbing. She was wet.
Right.
Yeah,
grab a Penthouse Forum. It's kind of funny. I know some horror writers who sort of they did that as a side gig, writing porn. And made pretty good money doing it. So
wait, are you telling me those were fake in Penthouse? No. What about everything comes down to the names? How did you go about naming the characters? What was behind that, Kevin? I'm sorry. I was like, what was behind the name Kevin? I keep thinking
you do
Kevin.
think I'm the porn magnet after all.
It must.
It's funny because I did work. It's a total side trip here, but I did work on Baltimore's famous block, which is the red light district in Baltimore. But that's another long digression. But in the 80s, I looked in the newspaper and I saw a job for a video editor. And, I had dropped out of college and the money was good. So I took the newspaper in my hand. And as I got closer to the location, I'm like, oh, this is the block. And so I didn't get hired to be a video editor, but I wound up being a paste up artist for a porno sort of video emporium on Baltimore's block. So that did kind of figure into the book, so there is a little bit of autobiography on the Kevin character.
I knew it. And
if you ask my mom to this day, she does not she completely blocked that out of her mind that I worked at that place, which is probably a good thing.
Yes,
my wife doesn't like when I talk about it either.
Well, this should only reach about 50,000 people, so don't worry about that. She could. And looking at the villains, I don't want to give away too much. I think that's always a problem when you interview fiction, because in nonfiction you give away the plot and then the listener sort of has to put the pieces together. But in fiction, obviously you can't give away the denouement and the climax, but we do find out pretty quick that the villains are called Crawford and Lily. And for me, I thought, of course, Lily, that's another name for the Virgin Mary, which was very interesting. I saw her as an anti-Sophia. But what about Crawford? At first, I thought Crawford, Texas, and George W.B. and Cheney and all that evil cabal. But then I thought, was Crawford something close to Crowley, or how did you come up with those names?
It's kind of a mix of things, and a real life story that was related to me that I would rather not spill details about. So the name comes from a real person out there, as well as sort of references those things you suggested. I mean, I wrote this during the Bush era, the W era, but I threw lots of stuff that I hope are sort of Easter eggs in there for people, especially as you get through all three books. And Blackwater, not to digress, but Blackwater, obviously was the Eric Prince, sort of mercenary army that was used in Iraq. So I was definitely kind of touching on that. But Crawford was an interesting amalgamation of a lot of different things. I found him particularly, disturbing. He really came to life in a really, scary way for me. And there's little details like his pinky fingernail is really long, and I remember meeting a kind of a odd guy once that had that long pinky fingernail. Whether it was a cokehead or what, I'm not really sure. But it really rolled a lot of my fears into both Crawford and Lily. Lily, again, there's Lilith, the demon, the Hebrew demon that ate children and things like that. And she, people really seem to love to hate her. They find her really, she's a classic femme fatale. She's sexy but wicked, and she uses her sexuality to lure Ray into what she wants to do with him. She's very manipulative, and I've always been fascinated by cult dynamics. I grew up, one of the things I remember from TV was the Jonestown Massacre and that imagery. And there were also lots of Christian cults that were operating when I was a kid. And I watched some of the adults I know get really drawn into, really kind of scary evangelical cults. So I love to play with that. And again, that's the whole 70s aesthetic to me of horror, is that there's a cult. There's the paranoid horror is that you're being drawn into something, I guess exemplified by Rosemary's Baby, where there's this woman who's being manipulated and she doesn't know it. And there's that gradual discovery that you are being lured into something, or you're trapped in something by a group of people who don't have your best your concerns in mind.
And that seems like a very powerful theme. That seems like a 21st century theme, is that everything seems fine, but in these little towns, symbolically, there's something rotting. There's something evil under the American dream. Kind of like the beginning of Blue Velvet, when the guy has a heart attack and underneath there's all these insects. Is that sort of what's going on in your novel?
Oh yeah, and Lynch is most definitely an influence and a major source of my aesthetic of the things that I write. I mean, no one has, it's that aspect of surrealism, the same way that King took suburban normalcy and stuck monsters in it. Lynch really did the same thing. But he showed the surrealism and the rot, like you said, when Jeffrey Beaumont finds that ear with bugs crawling on it, or in Twin Peaks, when we discover the wickedness that's going on in these seemingly beautiful, normal families, that aesthetic is also something that's just sticks to me, and it seems it's something that just comes out in almost everything I do. And I think, I don't want to say that I'm deriving things from Lynch, but the Lynchian aesthetic feels very real. It feels like he really he really shines a light on the surrealism in our reality, and especially nowadays as the simulation seems to be breaking down ever more spectacularly. It really resonates.
Yeah, I like to often quote that passage from The Watchmen by Alan Moore, when Night Owl asks the comedian what happened to the American dream, and he says, "It came true, you're looking at it." I think that's what we're seeing today. And
yeah,
the rot is coming out everywhere. So
yeah, for a while maybe we could spray some perfume on it, or dab some makeup on it, but it's just festering, and
or bomb another country, start a war or something.
Right. Yep, but yeah, that's a really great, that's a perfect quote.
Yes, and this certainly dovetails to what I want to ask you next. Speaking of the rot, as many don't know, you are the force behind the binding spell on Donald Trump, and you were even mentioned in such major publications as BuzzFeed. Tell us a little bit about that and why you decided to do it, Michael.
Yeah. Well, I've practiced magic of various sorts on and off since my 20s, really, and even as a kid, I sort of had a strong belief in that the universe was really magic, even though I was being told that it didn't work that way. So as I watched what happened over this previous election. And I've always been an activist, a political activist. I've never, I know it's become kind of common in alternative circles to sort of see, being involved in such, mundane silliness as politics, as being kind of a futile thing to do. I've always been very engaged politically, and it went back to watching my dad. He recorded the Watergate hearings on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I remember watching him with the TV on, the reels of the tape recorder turning, and wondering what this was all about. And but then when I was in my teens, I got very involved in the anti-nuclear movement, thanks to a cool, folk singing hippie guy I met. He was also into punk rock, so that made him even cooler. So and ever since then, I believe in being active. If you care about something, then actually, put your feet on the ground and make phone calls and all that sort of stuff,
instead of just share it on Facebook or something.
Right, yeah, slacktivism. It's which is funny, but that's kind. I've been accused of that for this whole Trump spell, but I'll come back to that in a bit. But anyway, I was watching as we were talking about the rot. I mean, it really seemed like reality was just breaking down around me, and things that things that I was seeing, the rise of the Trump sort of authoritarianism, and the crass way that he and his people were was really devaluing discourse. I, like a lot of people, started getting terrified. And unlike a lot of people, I also strongly believe that he had a very good chance to win the election. And I think a lot of other sort of magically attuned people felt the same way. We felt what was happening in a way that, the 538s and the number crunchers who were on TV saying there was no chance that Trump could win. I just didn't buy that. Like I felt more so than logically understood that he could win. So when he did win, I wasn't shocked at all. But I was alarmed. I was alarmed at what I saw happening very quickly with attacks on the environment, with attacks on civil liberties, just the putting people in charge of government organizations like the EPA, people who said they were going to, people who tried to destroy the agencies that they're now being put in charge with, that are charged with regulations that keep our water clean and et cetera. And it just seemed like an out of control freight train of bad news. And it started instantly. And these white nationalists who were being emboldened, and just stuff I saw rippling through my social media, this divisions that were being created. I was terrified, like a lot of people, and I was really dispirited. And since I communicate with people in the magic world, we were talking about things like, well, what do we do? Is there anything we can do magically? And we talked about, the cone of power operation, which may or may not have taken place, but Gerald Gardner and a bunch of witches got together and raised a cone of power to keep Hitler from invading England. And there's Diane Fortune also had she would send out these letters to the people in the Society of the Inner Light, which was her occult fraternity organization, and she would guide them through meditations that were sort of a way to, again, stop Hitler from what he was doing. And we were bouncing these things around, and I thought, well, maybe we can do a spell. And even to us, it sounded a little funny because, normally that's kind of a weird thing. But I strongly felt like this was something that needed to be public. And there was some pushback from some of my occultist friends who said, no, you do magic in secret. But I felt like the other model was the yippies exercising and levitating the Pentagon, which was a very powerful, potent act that a lot of people know about. I mean, it just had resonance. It had symbolic and mythic resonance. So I said, well, why don't we put something together and I'll publish it and we'll see what happens. And I really thought it would be a very niche sort of thing. And so I polished it, and since I'm a writer, I tweaked it a little bit, and we went back and forth, and we did try to model it after binding spells, which are very common. They're some of the oldest spells that we have in the written record from the Greek magical papyri and things like that. So I tried to make it very real. I also tried to make it sort of generic, so that it could be adapted to different styles of magic or different beliefs or practices, that you could kind of finagle it and plug it in your own style. But it had basic things like the representations of the 4 classical elements. And, since I think humor is very effective in magic, I added the use of a stubby orange candle to represent Trump. and So we crafted this thing, and I polished it up, and we went back and forth a little bit, and I published it on Medium, and literally within hours, I was watching it explode virally, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And honestly, I was shocked. I was freaked out. I never had anything go viral that had my name attached to it like that. And within a couple of days, I was besieged with phone calls for interviews. I was on radio shows. I was at my office at work. I had to stick a piece of paper, on the phone, do not disturb.
Wow.
And literally, it was, for days this went on. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then And this is, I mean, I was so shocked, and I started to not. I really had no idea how big it was still going to get. And so people started calling me up and they're like, we want to film this. And I said, well, you can, so I had a film crew that was going to come and film a group of people I work with here in Baltimore. But they really wanted something, bigger and newsworthy. So I said, I hear there are going to be a lot of people doing it at Trump Tower. Now, at that moment, I hadn't heard anything about people doing it at Trump Tower. But I told these media folks that anyway. And somehow the word circulated, and sure enough, about 20 witches showed up outside of Trump Tower in New York City and did the ritual in February, the very first binding ritual. And it was beautiful. There were all these, I think it was mostly women sitting down, doing this spell with these candles and feather and, container of salt and water and this sort of thing, and burning this image of Donald Trump. And there's a Christian fundamentalist woman with a mirror who's just in their faces, holding the mirror up to them to send back their evil. And it was just beautiful theater, and the media just ate it up, and and at that point, I thought, well, wow, this has been a crazy ride, but it just kept getting bigger. Then a Facebook group formed, and they sort of worked with me, and people volunteered to be moderators. There's like, all close to, I think it's going on to 3,000 people in that group now. And every month, which was the way we had planned the spell, was to be done on the waning crescent moon every month until he's out of office. And it's still getting bigger. Every time the binding night comes around, there's just a new influx of people. And it's just amazing. And for something that I thought maybe, a dozen, maybe 50 people max might find this interesting enough to do it. And then finding out that people who had never done magic in their lives were doing this too. And they're like, what the hell? What do I have to lose? And it was thrilling and humbling too, and it was, there's all sorts of pushback. Interestingly enough, a lot of it came from the occult community and witches, saying this is going to come back with a threefold law and get your karma. And I said, well, first of all, I'm not a witch, so I don't.
And I think they're getting the idea of the threes and the karma wrong, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, and I respect Wiccans. I have a lot of Wiccan friends, and it really became witches against Trump, which was not how it was envisioned at all. And the people that I developed this with and bounced it off of are not witches. They're magical practitioners of different types, but none of them are witches. But it got taken up by witches. And I found that fantastic, but I'm not a witch. So, I kept getting called a witch in all these reports and things. Like, I'm not a witch. But, whatever. The media, the people in the media, they hear spell and it becomes witch because they don't understand the various different kinds of magic and schools of magic and that sort of thing. But the pushback from the occult community, there's a guy named David Griffin, who's the Grand Poobah Imperator of a Golden Dawn group. And he turned it into a magical war, because he's a Trump supporter. And, he started cursing us. I started getting, threats from people. Wow. And some of the pushback from occultists was that it was just bad magic. And, you have to do magic in secret or it doesn't work. And I said, well, what about, the whole idea of cursing people and, voodoo and traditions like that? The person needs to know that the magic is being done against them. That's part of the efficacy. And I think a lot of it was kind of sour grapes too. I think a lot of, people who have been working really hard, teaching classes and writing books on magic and witchcraft and things like that. Who am I? Suddenly I'm out there getting all this publicity. So I think there was an element of that to some extent too. But I expected the fundamentalist Christian response. I knew that. I totally expected that, but I didn't expect so much blowback from occultists. But so that was a little surprising. But it really, and the other important thing about the spell was it was designed as what I called a self-exorcism, because so many of us did feel so beaten down by what we saw happening and just so powerless in a way. And it was designed as a way for people to feel they're getting their power back from this Trumpian egregore that just seems to be oozing out of everything and just devouring our consciousness. And that, if nothing else, that works for a lot of people. So many people have said, every time I do this ritual, I feel better. I feel like I've pulled myself out of that. I feel like I have power again. I have control. And if nothing else, like that was critical. That was a critical aspect. So if people could say, well, is it working? Is it not working? I don't know. It's hard to quantify. Magic isn't a science. It's an art. It works symbolically. It works in, ways that you can't measure out. But in that respect, I think it definitely worked. And that's what is the most rewarding thing for me as being someone who developed this, is that it's helped people sort of disengage and feel like they have some autonomy again. And so that, more than anything else, really is what I find the most rewarding about this whole experience.
Interesting you say Trump egregore. I keep going back to what happened to the American dream. It came true. We're living it in the way we deserve it. I mean, I hate to say this, but this is what we got. And it's also very interesting because when my wife heard about it, she was going to be part of the Catholic faction that was going to do a rosary to stop your evil plans, Michael. And I had to explain, one, that I know you and you're a good guy. And then I had to remind her that before she re-embraced Catholicism, she was doing binding spells. And she knows that they don't cause any harm. So she was like, okay, I just won't do it. So very interesting. And that's the point. It's not supposed to cause harm.
Exactly. That was I tried to make that very clear. And, and if you read the spell itself, it is designed to prevent harm very specifically to things like the environment, to our to justice, to, our polity, and to essentially to stop harm, not to generate harm. Although, synchronistically, the night after the first binding in February, and we, as a note, the Tarot Tower card is used in this particular spell for obvious, reasons related to Trump Tower and things like that. But the day after the first binding spell, there was an electrical fire in Trump Tower. And I was so glad that it didn't cause damage or hurt anyone, or I might have had to go into the witness protection program with my family. And so, it was very specifically and stringently crafted to bind and not to harm. And that's, other people have, thrown hexes at the man and things like that. That's not my style. I think he's a dangerous person. I think it's all hands on deck time to, if you care about the things that many of us care about. But I don't believe in trying to cause harm to anyone.
Michael, you've also been very vocal recently about the modern conspiracy movie and the turn it's taken, and you've also written about it very publicly. Tell us about your issue with a movement that you've been part of for a long time.
Yeah, I sort of had a breakup with the conspiracy world. It was a long time simmering and festering. I've been in the conspiracy realm, the conspiracy world since I was a kid and started reading about the Kennedy assassination. Obviously, anyone who is into UFOs and spends any time looking at the history of UFOs, you see that there's a very clear cover-up. Now, what is being covered up is obviously subject to a lot of conjecture, but it's clear if you just look at the documents that are available that there is a rather extensive cover-up that globally that's been going on in regard to that subject. And speaking of the Kennedy conspiracy, the death of Jim Marrs hit me pretty hard because his book Crossfire was the first book that opened my eyes to the possibility of the U.S. government being involved in conspiracy. So I love the stuff. I find it fascinating. I find the culture fascinating. There are clearly conspiracies. The deaths of JFK, MLK, RFK all seem very clearly to be very likely conspiracies involving people in the U.S. government or people aligned with the U.S. government. So I'm not a conspiracy disbeliever by any means. But what I've seen is a change, and I think it's exacerbated by social media. Something changed, and there's been whereas conspiracy communities used to lean politically left, almost exclusively, people like John Judge and Jim Marrs and things like that, leaned a little more to the classic political left. What I've seen is a real rightward turn in conspiracy thinking, and that's always been there. If you look back at the 50s, there's with Father Coughlin and anti-Semites and things talking about, it's the Jews, that the Jews are running things, the Trilateral Commission, things like that. There's always been an element, sort of a neo-fascist
or the Satanic
element.
Panic or some of
right,
the
Satanic Panic, things like that, and it's always been there, but it comes and goes. I just noticed so much more of it. It's what's now called the alt-right resurgence. And what really drove it home were a couple of two things in particular. The first was Newtown. And I found out about what happened at Newtown. I was at my job, at my desk, and I think I pulled up CNN or something, and the photo was loading kind of slowly. But as the headline photo came in, I recognized someone in that picture, and it was an old girlfriend of mine's sister, and she was running with a panicked look on her face. And so from the minute I learned about Newtown, I had a personal connection there, and I found out that this woman friend of mine who lived there, her best friend, a couple she was friends with, and the woman was her best friend. They lost their child at Sandy Hook Elementary School. And my friend also happened to be a social worker, so she became the grief counselor for a lot of these parents. And to watch as people like Alex Jones and others turned that tragedy into this, psyop thing, just sickened me. And I ran into a guy at a Fortean convention who came up to me and started talking about it. He's like, no, that's all fake. Those people are crisis actors. And it took everything in me not to just punch him. I'm a very nonviolent person, but to have some idiot who, just because of crap he read on the internet, decides that that never happened. And I tried to talk to him, like, do you realize what will be involved in perpetuating such an enormous hoax? And why would the government create a hoax about a shooting that would involve paying people to be actors, that would, the web of people that would need to be involved in that, the resources that would have to be put into that? Why wouldn't they just pay somebody to actually go shoot up all those kids? That whole idea just falls apart under the most simple scrutiny, if you apply logic to it. But these people they're not working with logic. They're living in a generated, Robert Anton Wilson calls it a reality tunnel. And it's cartoonish. Terence McKenna said conspiracy theories are like a cartoon reality. And I think there's a real element to that. It simplifies the narrative. It allows you, as someone exposing this conspiracy, to be like a crusader for truth and righteousness. I mean, it feels cool to think that you are exposing something, exposing a lie.
Michael, I think in a way I can understand, because when I picture the idea of some guy mowing down innocent children or Jews being gassed in the concentration camp, sometimes my mind wants to write it off and say this horror cannot exist. Maybe there's another alternative fact. I just said that because even when my mom died, it was so horrific. In my mind, I was saying, well, maybe the hospital made a mistake. It was creating conspiracy theories. So I think part of it is we just don't want to face the horror sometimes.
Yeah, it's face the horror. And what is horrible is the idea, like, just like you mentioned, that this shit just happens. And we have no control over it. There's no one pulling the strings. Just horrible things happen. It's banal. The idea that there's no one pulling the strings, there's no one in control, and these kind of things just happen, I think is deeply existentially terrifying. And that's why we invent these narratives. So that the whole psyop crisis actor thing was the first thing to push me over the edge. But I still didn't want to give up my sort of ties to the conspiracy community. But what really drove it over the edge was, as you know, because we've talked about it a little bit, is Pizzagate.
Ah, yes. Pizzagate, yes.
Yeah.
And how did you feel when it first came out? Because like you said, at first, it seemed, all right, we can all be citizen journalists. I mean, the evidence is right there. We can tie it together, and we can finally, us little people, stick it to the elite and stick it to the issue of pedophilia.
Right.
Or did you smell a rat immediately?
No, I didn't smell a rat immediately. And I have a little bit of history with this because I was probably the one person most rigorously chronicling the Hosanna Church case, which happened in the 90s. And that was in Ponchatoula, Louisiana. And basically someone walked into a police station and said, guess what? I've been abusing, ritualistically abusing children in this church, and all these other people are part of it. And he walked into the detective's office and unloaded all of his stuff. He had a diary. There were reports at the time of weird symbols drawn on the walls in the church, in the main room of the church. There was all this other seemingly confirmatory reports coming out about costumes found in a shed and hard drives with horrible stuff on them. And it seemed like really a prime example of something that was largely just myth before then. So I deeply into that particular case, but then it started to fall apart as time went on, and it started to look more like a case of, you know, a bunch of people caught up in one particular woman's sort of, you know, twisted religious fantasy, and the prosecution started to fall apart, and it left me feeling very ambiguous about the subject. So when Pizzagate first came up, you know, friends were sending me links, and I thought, well, maybe this is really something. So I didn't immediately reject it. I always try to, you know, be as open-minded as I can, within my own biases and things like that. So I started looking into it, but it immediately smelled like a rat, like you said. And the more, what I have always tried to do, and I kind of learned this from Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna and other people, and that is to always, if I start to believe something, is to try to take the devil's advocate position and interrogate the hell out of what I want to believe, really take my biases and just attack them. And that's kept me out of a lot of holes, you know, a lot of deep pits, rabbit holes that, you know, people fall into and can't get out. So I started attacking this idea of Pizzagate, and the more I looked into it, the more I interrogated it with logic and with the attempt to see if there were alternative explanations, the more it really started to fall apart. Now, there are some oddities, you know. I mean, John Podesta, in some of those emails, they're clearly speaking in code. But when I read those emails and I tried to think what they could be talking about, it didn't seem to be pedophilia. First of all, you know, if you're a pedophile, people write in code because they know someone might be reading it, you know. And I really don't think these Washington bigwigs are going to be, you know, cavalierly using code to talk about pedophilic behavior, you know, activities that could put them behind bars forever. But what do people talk in code about? I remembered what I talked in code about, and that's drugs. So it seemed very likely that when they're talking about, you know, pizza sauce and things like that, the parsimonious explanation is not that it's some, you know, pedophile code, which didn't match the facts anyway, but that they're talking about something else. And I thought it was probably likely drugs. You know, marijuana is legalized in Washington, D.C. now. So, but if you're John Podesta, or if you're high up in the DNC or something like that, you're not going to want to be talking about, oh, I left my bag of weed, you know, when I was in your kitchen. But you might say, hey, is this your pizza on a napkin, you know, or something like that. It makes a hell of a lot more sense than thinking people are just talking openly in code and email, which we know people read emails and they're not secure, about something as profoundly criminal as pedophilia. And so that was the one thing. But then just applying simple logic. Okay, if you're running how do you run a pedophile ring where you're bringing in children and apparently disappearing them in a popular restaurant in the middle of DC, where you've got 40 plus people working for you, and none of those people are going to see something weird, you know, kids being led into the restaurant and never coming out, or, you know, there are cameras everywhere. I mean, we live in a surveillance state. There are cameras all over that block. Do you think, you know, you're bringing children in to, you know, perform, you know, cannibalistic sexual rituals on them, that's no one's going to find out about that, including the people who are in that restaurant all day long? I mean, the whole thing just falls apart under the most basic scrutiny. But try telling that to the true believers, you know. And I went on a podcast. I guess I don't, you know, been pretty public about it. So I don't know if it's okay to mention the name of the podcast or not. But it's a very well-known podcast. And, I spend hours going over my notes and things like that. And the host of that podcast, as soon as, we started recording, just harangued me and just kept saying, there are these elite pedophiles and this is what they do. And I said, well, okay, maybe I'll give you that. But what about this piece of, where is your data? Like, where are your facts? You're accusing people of one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. I have kids, okay? I can't imagine what it must be like to find out something like that has happened to one of your kids. And these internet sleuths, okay, who they've never been to Comet Ping Pong, they've never met the Podestas, they've never seen these bands that are, allegedly part of it and things like that. They're accusing real people of the most absolutely horrific crime anyone can be accused of. And they're causing real harm. I mean, we know that the guy with the gun who listened to too much Alex Jones went barging in and shot up the place. I mean, the real people, there were kids and their families in the restaurant when the guy with a gun comes walking in there. So to me, these internet Sherlock Holmeses who are perpetuating this based entirely on anecdote, supposition, and lies, push this thing into the mainstream. And it was just a final straw for me. And there's another podcast that when I first started really tearing this subject down and trying to apply, rigorous scrutiny to it, there's another podcast, and the host of that podcast, we were going back and forth about it on Twitter, and I said, well, why don't you give me your best case for Pizzagate? Give me the best evidence that you have on hand. And he sent me a link to Vote, VOAT, where people have been compiling all the arguments in favor of this, this pedophilic ritual satanic conspiracy. And I spent way too much time going over each point for point. And I posted that on Medium too. And I said, well, what do you think of this? And he never replied. This was in December. And it's, what is it? It's August now. And several times I've said, hey, I ask you for your best summary of Pizzagate, the best evidence. And I went through and addressed it, and you won't reply to me. And he still hasn't replied. And his show still continues to push this nonsensical conspiracy. And why, I don't know. I don't know why both of these guys, they're sincere, I think, about what they believe. But this stuff is titillating. It's interesting. And people might say, oh God, how could you call that titillating? Well, it's a creepy story. It works on people's emotions, and it gets people very worked up, as we've seen. And this thing still lives. I've watched forums that I've been part of and groups online, almost fall apart because of this insane conspiracy, which is what it is. It's absurd. It's not rooted in reality at all. So finally I said, you know what, I'm done. Like I'm getting to be an old guy. There's lots of things I want to do. There's lots of things I want to do in life. And I can't try to pull people out of that pit anymore. And some of them like it down there. I'm convinced. Some people like this darkness. They're happy to be swimming in this, sewer, this conceptual sewer that's not rooted in fact. And I can't throw them a rope anymore. If you want to swim in that stuff, that's your call. So it really was a breakup. I said, I can't do this stuff anymore. It's a toxic mentality, and it's so rooted in things that aren't real. And I'm not saying there aren't like organized pedophile networks out there. Anyone who's read about the things that go on in Hollywood, sure. I mean, there are horrible things that are happening, but just because there are horrible things that are happening doesn't mean you have to grasp on to something that is not real. Yes, these things happen, but that doesn't mean when you hear about something that it grants it legitimacy, because the whole Pizzagate thing is nonsensical. There's weird stuff, sure. There's oddities and things. John Podesta's brother has very dark taste in art, but I'm a horror writer. I have a dark taste in art too. Some of the art that was on his walls, I wouldn't have in my home, but I can't say having a dark taste in art makes you a dark person, because most of the horror writers I know are some of the nicest, kindest people. I'm a freaking vegetarian. I don't like killing cows and chickens. But I'll write really, horrific things in my books. So it was just a mess, and I said I'm done. Especially after the experience of the podcast, where the host decided not to air our discussion. I think partly because maybe he realizes he was yelling at me the whole time, but maybe also because he realizes there's nothing there. And I've noticed a little bit of a turn in people in the community that they're starting to back away from it a little bit, and I'm really happy to see that.
And where can the listener find out more about you and your work, Michael?
Yeah, sure.
And Kevin too, your other half,
my porn magnet alter ego, right? Well, the Blackwater Lights series. I have good news if you don't like to wait for books in a series to come out. The third book, Demon Lights, is now out. It's available through Penguin Random House's digital imprint Hydra. It's only available as an ebook at the moment, but you can get it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Apple or Google, wherever you find that sort of thing. If you like conspiracy, even though I've been kind of dumping on conspiracy, if you like conspiracy, if you like supernatural stuff, we talked about the book. And it gets very deeply into magic. So it really is it rolls up all of my weird fixations into what I hope is a fun story. So you can get all three books now. If you just want to read my other writing, if you go to michaelmhughes.com, there's links to my videos, my talks, my writings on Medium, the Trump binding spell. There's a Facebook group for if you're into the Trump binding spell or you want to find out more about that. It's called Bind Trump. So that's very easy to find. It's a really, really great supportive community of lots of people there. So lots of places to find me, but Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff. It's easy. It's easy today. Much easier than it used to be. Yes. www.geocities/
Yes, indeed. And for the listener, check him out. I read Blackwater Lights in less than 2 days. That's how good it was. So, and I think that's all the time we have today. I'm sure my wife will force me to do the rosary after this interview, but I'll send you some notes.
Tell her there are lots of Christians and Catholics that are part of this binding thing. So,
okay, good.
It's very inclusive. I think regardless of people's religion, we all want to do the best that we can for the country we live in. Those of us that live in this country. So she's more than welcome to check it out. It's no harm to the soul.
There you go. Very aeonic in an Archon world. And but again, that's all the time we have today. Thank you very much, Michael, for coming on Aeon Byte. And we need to get you back on so we can deal with Twin Peaks.
Oh, yeah. Oh, man. Don't get me started.
That's a whole nother binding. That's going to take a couple hours.
But no, thank you. I've loved your show since I first started listening to it, which a long time ago. So you've been doing a great job, and keep it up. It was a real honor and a pleasure to be here.
And there you have it, a mind-expanding, reality-dispanding interview with Michael Hughes, author of the Blackwater Lights trilogy, covering many topics and delivering so much gnosis. In the second part, we delve deeper into the whole Pizzagate, pedogate issue, and cover other conspiracy theories like JFK's assassination, 9/11, and much more. In the end, Michael provides Sophia advice on how to navigate these days of quicksand information in order to rise to the suns of inner peace and magic using. And as mentioned in the introduction, how to give the demiurge so much joy by defeating him in the video game called Life. So please join for a mere $5.99 a lunar cycle. Beyond full interviews, you'll get more than 350 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoterica, and free thought. You'll also be invited to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where Michael will be there to answer your questions in our usual Q&A session. And we have some remarkable discussions, and past guests hang out there like Tim Freak, Robert Price, Andrew Phillips Smith, Scott Smith, and Robert Sullivan. And I'm always there to answer your questions or issues too. Of course, if you've got holes in your pockets because of the games of Archons, just let me know and I'll be glad to send you any of the complete shows. Becoming a member really helps keep this Red Pill Cafeteria open. If that's not your game of choice or Game of Thrones, you can also become a patron at Patreon, where you get some of the same benefits as becoming a member. Or maybe a few shekels here or there via PayPal or the US mail. You can always help by buying some of me books, like Voices of Gnosticism, Other Voices of Gnosticism, Stargazer, and Heretic. I can't do it without you, in more ways than one. All forms of support are found at, you got it, thegodabovegod.com. Thank you so much for being here. It is my hope that I and our astral guests have helped you find the mysteries that work for you and only you. Get you a little bit closer to defeating God. But the song is over. Thought I'd have more to say. And like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Hello and goodbye as always.